Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Come on. Good morning. That's better. Makes me feel welcome now. Okay, so as you can see on the slide there, we're talking about a little known problem called phishing. Now, before we go much further, how many of you have experienced a phishing message in the last week? Received a message? Okay, so for the benefit of the recording, a good half of the hands went up there. And bearing in mind the camera's not on you, it's on me, how many of you have responded to a phishing message being unaware that it was a phishing message in the past at all? Okay, nobody. That's good. You're all security aware. Unfortunately, you are not the typical pattern of the whole population, as we shall see. So, in terms of an outline for the talk, just making sure this is working, beginning with a bit of an overview of what this threat actually is, just to evidence the fact it does exist to some degree, the scope and scale of the problem, and the fact that unfortunately, as time has gone on, it has not got less, it has actually got worse. And then looking at some findings from a recent, small scale, but interesting nonetheless, experimental study that colleagues and I did at the University of Plymouth, looking particularly at the ability of some of our technology to detect phishing messages to avoid us having to be able to spot them out for ourselves. Reflecting on the results of that, and then some conclusions. Okay, so you're all aware of this phishing problem, and with good reason, because it's been with us now for over 15 years. Around 2003, I think, was when you started to see the first real emergence of phishing as a threat and starting to get reported in surveys and media reports, etc. But nonetheless, it's still something, as your show of hands just now illustrated, that we face on a regular basis. The volume of the messages is getting worse, and the guises in which they're appearing is getting more creative. So, not gone are the days of the messages looking like something that says, please verify your bank account details. We still get plenty of those, but we also get many other forms as well. I have some that I'll illustrate as we go. Now, of course, as a result of this, we've got various technologies that are there to try and help us. We've got things that are in the network looking to block the messages. We've got filtering. But we still get them. Again, your show of hands shows we're still receiving this stuff on our devices, on the desktop, etc. So we need a level of awareness as users to be able to spot things. But many users, of course, would much prefer to rely on the technology. So there's a question of how much can we do that? How much can the technology protect us, flag things up for us, even if it's not blocking them completely at source? And if we look at some of the evidence around to show this scale, one of the sources I've drawn here, the UK Cybersecurity Breaches Survey from this year, the results are very much the same as the last couple of years, showing that fraudulent emails are amongst the most commonly encountered problems amongst the respondent organisations. So we're talking here about a population of around, let's say, 1,500 UK businesses, part of the respondent group, and 80% of them reported, as the category was called, fraudulent emails or being directed to fraudulent websites. Okay, vastly ahead of some of the other forms of problem that they are encountering. So things like malware and ransomware, still a problem, but not to the scale of this. Not to say that the impact of the problems is all the same, but certainly the likelihood of encountering this is significantly greater. Moreover, talking about the impact, almost half of them cited phishing as causing the most disruption to their organisation in the prior 12 months. So it is something that's impactful and causing issues. And also, the second most commonly reported form of attack there mentioned others impersonating the organisation in emails or online. Well, we can see that that has a potential relationship to the phishing problem as well, potentially being impersonated in that context. But they're not being the recipient, being the one masqueraded as. So, okay, I've said that this problem is growing. I've shown that it's significantly encountered in organisations. Let's see how the problem has evolved over the years in terms of scale. So these results are from the anti-phishing working group, which has existed for a number of years now, receiving reports and creating intelligence around the phishing problem. And what we can see here in the rather fetching orangey yellow shade, is the number of unique phishing sites being reported in the different sampled years. So I've taken some snapshots of years through the time period. So 2004, once phishing had been around for a little while, it was starting to get some attention. 2008, 2013 were on the way, and then the full extent of last year. And then we can see also the number of unique phishing emails being reported. This isn't the number of emails full stop that people have received. This is the unique reports of different messages, different phishing campaigns going around. And the most striking thing, I think, is the degree to which this problem has increased over time. So whilst awareness of the problem has grown, whilst the technologies, the safeguards, perhaps the awareness raising in organizations and for general users has arguably increased, the problem hasn't gone away. We've got more of a problem to need that protection against. Now, of course, all types of phishing are not the same, so just to give some of the different categories that you might encounter, what I'd call bulk phishing or generic phishing. It's the sort that I mentioned before, the please verify your bank account details type of thing that you might encounter. You very often sort of pick that out as being phishing because you know you don't bank with the bank that it's masquerading as, and you know you can immediately ignore it. If it did happen to come in, sort of happening to coincide with a bank you're banking with, then perhaps it gives you more pause for thought. But these are generally just messages that are sent out indiscriminately, and they happen to find potential targets. Spear phishing, we're talking about something that is more targeted now, where the attacker, the scammer, has done some form of reconnaissance, information gathering, and they're targeting it at a particular organization, for example, and the staff within it. Clone phishing, where you're taking a message that's already been sent and resending it, perhaps with a different attachment, different links, perhaps claiming it's a resend of the previous message, but perhaps more likely to catch people out because they've seen the original, they thought it was legitimate then, and now this time they're more inclined to believe it, even though now it's a scam. And then whaling, another more targeted one, going after high value or high prominence individuals within an organization. So different types that we may encounter. Now, what I'll look at in the study as we go through is basically examples of bulk phishing, so the ability of some of the technology to detect that. Okay, and also another term that's getting increasing prominence as a name and also as an abbreviation of BEC is business email compromise. Basically, where an attacker is using phishing, an attacker is impersonating a senior executive or similar in an organization, sending a message to somebody else, a more general employee, or a vendor, a partner of the organization, and trying to dupe them into doing something that compromises the organization commercially, financially, etc. And this was the most significant form of problem reported in the US's Internet Crime Complaint Center survey in the last year. You see that one there, sort of the combination of losses from business email compromise and specifically phishing, dwarfing many of the other categories of abuse again. Okay, so talking about the problem, let's look at just some examples of the, well, actual scam and phishing emails that I've received in my inbox or spam folder just recently. So here's one that found its way through to the inbox without any form of flagging as being potentially spam or malicious. And this one trying to encourage me to follow some links to an alleged Dropbox for Business link. Now this is not necessarily phishing, but this is some sort of scam email probably trying to lead me towards malware. Still coming in via email, so still a vector we need to be concerned about. This one, now impersonating, actually targeting to people within my institution in the name of our Vice-Chancellor, so trying to catch people, tricking them into opening a message because they believe it's from the boss, so to speak, and opening the attachment. Again, not necessarily phishing in this context, very likely to lead to some sort of malware, compromising their system, could end up with the same sort of end result as phishing because the system could be breached. This one is a phishing-related example. This one arrived just yesterday. This one claiming to be from our IT service desk. And I'm running out of email space, folks, so I need to click the link and log in, which will require my password, to get more capacity. Do you think I did it? I did? No, I didn't. Luckily, I was aware enough in that case to think that this might not be genuine, so I didn't follow the link. I do wonder if other people within the organisation might have believed that they were running out. And then this one which basically says, no, don't worry, this isn't phishing because it's not asking you to send financial details. So it's not one of those messages. It's just asking for your name, your date of birth, your age, all your contact details. So it's not phishing. It's just asking for that information. Not sure what they're going to do with it afterwards, but again, dressed up in a slightly different context. Okay, so it's not really clear if we look for findings and results, what proportion of people do fall for phishing. None of you said you did, so that's good. So maybe it's 0% more generally. Probably not. Certainly when organisations put it to the test and do mock phishing scams and things of this nature, mock phishing testing, to see if their employees are susceptible, they come back with considerable positive, well, negative, I guess, in that context, results because people are falling for it. So, for example, in the US Postal Service, where they'd done some training of their employees, I think, prior to this, they sent an email message round, over 3,000 employees, and, well, the significant proportion of employees failed to report receiving the message, which actually the company's policy that they've been leisurely trained about suggested they should be doing, and a quarter of them attempted to follow the link that they'd been sent, which could, of course, have put them and their systems into significant danger depending on what that link was leading to, or indeed what it was asking them to then divulge. Another result that sort of shows another less encouraging picture, the average success rate, according to this study from Bernstein et al. Back in 2014, University of California and Google collaborating on this one, they found that the average success rate of phishing messages that they'd used there was over 13%, almost 14% success rate, depending on the nature of the message and the hook that was being used. So a significant potential for people to fall victim, depending on how it's been presented and dressed up. And also, variation according to the type of recipient, the type of user that receives it or indeed is targeted. So at the bottom there, we see, okay, according to this study from Positive Technologies, only 3% of IT security people were falling victim to phishing. Sort of vaguely encouraging, because you'd expect them to be the most aware. But almost a third of general employees finding themselves susceptible. So what that points towards, perhaps, is some need to bridge the gap between what security people know because it's their job, and what general users ought to know just in the sense of some sort of cyber awareness, that streetwiseness of being online, which many people seem to lack, even though they regularly use online technologies. So an issue around awareness raising and user education coming out perhaps there. Okay, now linking to that is the thing here, this experimental study that we did. Looking really to say, okay, if you don't do any awareness raising and you rely on the technology to protect people, as many people will be relying on it themselves, to what extent is that technology going to do the job? So this is just a little investigation using some webmail services as examples to see the extent to which they would spot and identify and flag potentially phishing messages that would be the basic text of phishing messages being replayed to them, to see if they would alert the user, if they would filter the messages out, etc. Okay, we were looking particularly, would they be able to warn based on the message content? So we weren't looking for things being stopped by blacklists, etc. It's, was the content of the message something that would enable it to be flagged out? So if somebody was creating a phishing message from scratch with a certain type of language, or indeed replaying known scams, would they be spotted? So 5 email service providers, which I've anonymized here, just calling them S1 through to S5. So S1, S2, and S3, they're all large international webmail services. And we selected those on the basis that they're in wide use by a significant proportion of the public population. Meanwhile, S4 and S5 were selected because they market themselves particularly as being sort of security-aware mail services. And therefore might be inspiring more trust amongst the potential user community. And in that context, if you're told that the mailing solution is more secure, you might expect more protection against mail-related problems. So, in order to do a realistic test, what we decided to do here was take some messages that had already been identified as phishing from archives and replay those to the mail services from new accounts. And basically, these were taken from archives that have been, or repositories that have been established by universities. So the flavor of some of the messages had a sort of targeting students or campus-based people, but others were far more general messages as well. But it's not, it must be acknowledged, representative of the wider population of phishing messages, whereas it says there, payment or financially related messages account for more than half of those, for example, that the anti-phishing working group would catalogue. So what we were looking at in terms of the messages and what we wanted them to have as characteristics were particular phrasing, links, and things of that nature that would be potentially characteristic of spottable phishing messages, identifiable phishing messages from the user's perspective. The sort of things that when I show you some examples, you will probably get a sense that they don't look like normal, legitimate messages. Here were the message titles. I won't show you the full content of all 20 messages because that would be a bit dull, but I'll show you some examples. But here were the full titles of the 20 that we used. And basically, we sent all of the messages, firstly, without any embedded links, and then again with the links that would have actually existed in the genuine attempt, just to see if there was any difference in the ability of the webmail services to pick them out, highlight them, label them, etc. So that gave us a total of 200 messaging attempts actually taking place. So, here's one of the examples, the don't get locked out of your account one. So this isn't with the link showing there, but there would be a click here, and that would be hyperlinked for somebody to view the document. Hands up if that looks like a sort of convincing message you would click the link for. I guess the clue is in the fact I'm telling you it's a phishing message, so you're all keeping your hands resolutely down, but hopefully you would have spotted this one if it came to you. What we hope is that the message service, the email, webmail client, would also be telling you this is spam. We'll see that in a minute. This one, a help desk notice with some special characters not displaying properly. We detect an unknown IP address, blah, blah, blah. Click here and verify your account. So your opportunity to provide your login details to whoever is asking for it. And a third example, if it works. We're upgrading our email system. How unusual. Please confirm your email is in use. Log in to confirm. Webmail team. As most people sign off like that. So again, I think looking at these, you can see, okay, these don't look particularly legitimate, and we would hope that users would be aware enough not to spot them. Would the webmail services be able to flag these as potentially problematic as well? Well, the answer, in many cases, is no. So in red there, we have the indication of the proportion of messages that found their way into the user's inbox. Okay? In the green, we've got those where the messages were directed to spam folders, and we've got one instance where the message didn't arrive at all, so it's hopefully filtered out, blocked somewhere else within the process. So what we see is, other than with Webmail Service 2, the vast majority of messages were finding their way into the user's inbox. Okay? And we've got there, in each of the cases, we've got what happened when we had no links in the message and what happened when we reinstated the hyperlinks, whether that, as you can see, in some cases, it enabled a proportion of the messages to then be identified as spam. So with links, obviously that's where you've got the link to follow, that's more likely to be picked out, but still not uniform success. What we also looked at was, were the messages labelled in some way? So, for example, if it did come into the inbox, was it highlighted as potentially suspicious, malicious, etc.? So the sort of thing I'm talking about is the indication that I've taken there. Now, I've taken that one from a normal desktop mail client so that it's not conveying any clue as to the 5 webmail services we were actually using. Of the 5, only 2 of them did any form of message labelling anyway, S1 and S2. And what you can see there is, okay, of those that arrived in the inbox, in the case of S1, the vast majority, again, were arriving with no labelling at all. In a couple of cases, when you had, well, the no links or with links, they were being flagged as potentially malicious, but most cases, they were not flagged at all. In the case of where messages went to spam, we can see, okay, service 2 was very successful. Actually, it put them in the spam folder and it was labeling them as spam as well, or flagging they were potentially spam, so you could see it when you opened the message. And a couple of them being suspected of being malicious, and nothing in that context being unlabeled because they've gone to the spam folder. But what that gives us overall, though, is the significant majority of cases, as we saw, actually made it through to the user's inbox rather than being redirected to junk, to spam, whatever it's called. And they weren't in any way labeled to identify them as malicious or junk mail or anything. And across the both phases of testing, the with links and without links, only 6% of the messages overall were explicitly labeled as this could be phishing, this could be a malicious message. Labeling as spam was notably higher, almost 20% overall, but that was largely down to the success of webmail service number 2. Now, it's interesting, that variation across the services, because they're all dealing with the same messages. All of those messages are known phishing messages, but only one of the 5 webmail services actually dealt with them, what I would say, competently. The other 4, quite variable, and in some cases quite poor. So, okay, there are some limitations in this study. We'll do some further stuff based on these initial findings. So, the overall size of the study was admittedly small, so both the number of messages involved, the variety of messages, and the webmail services under test. And I say also what we were testing. So, we didn't look, for example, at whether attachments in messages made any difference. In actual fact, though, in many of the phishing cases, you're not dealing with attachments, so what we're interested in is whether the messages with links were being flagged as a problem. And nonetheless, I say it's a realistic test of whether some representative, genuinely used, popular webmail services were able to spot known phishing messages and warn their users accordingly. And I say involving genuine content that are already featured in known attacks. And we also, just to make sure we were getting some level of consistency, made up a couple of messages with phishing-style wording to see if they also were treated in a similar way. So is it fair? Is this a reasonable test of the sites? Well, okay, should they be able to do it on the basis of message content rather than looking at where the messages are coming from, looking at blacklists, etc.? Well, overall, we would say yes, and actually our results support the fact that it's reasonable to do it because some of the webmail services, S2 in particular, Service 2, was able to do it. And so that's in stark contrast to Services 3 and 5, which allowed everything through into the inbox without any marking for attention. So in conclusion then, what does that tell us about the technology and whether we as users can rely upon it to provide the safety net for us? Well, it can provide some form of safety net in some cases, but that net has certainly got holes in it. It doesn't remove, at this stage, the responsibility of the user and the need for the user to have some form of awareness. Certainly the variation in the results that we observed, that gives an indication that services could improve. Some of those that are currently there could do as well as others that are there. Okay, if one can do it, they could all potentially do it. They need to improve the underlying technology. There are areas that you could advance or you could utilize in order to do this sort of content-based identification. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, they're thrown around quite readily in cybersecurity. This is an opportunity to learn what the phishing message, the language of the message looks like using stylometry, etc. And what it also highlights is, at this stage, we still need to do that bit of user awareness raising. We need to help people understand what scam messages look like, the sort of things that they shouldn't be sharing, and the mechanisms by which they shouldn't be sharing it. Okay? Otherwise, they are going to be significantly vulnerable. So it tells ultimately the same sort of story as was already mentioned in Socrates' talk there, that it's not a choice between technology and policy and people, it's the effective combination of the two. Now, if you want further information on this, it's very shortly to appear written up as a paper in Computer Fraud and Security with my colleagues Kieran and Maria in that particular case. And that's the details, so just look out for that one if you want the full details of how we did it. And other than that, my contact details are there if you want to get hold of me, ask questions outside of the context of the conference. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was really quite enlightening. I think everybody has a problem with phishing. I know that I certainly do. We now have a very